Do you want free healthcare? Go to Spain. You don't even need to prove you're there legally. Just show up and the good old Spanish taxpayer will pay for it. And if you have troubles showing up, just wait for your turn in the northwest of Morocco, because the Spanish Supreme Court absolutely ordered the government to get even more illegals, regardless of whether the country can afford it, or indeed if the actual Spanish people who pay for all of this want it or not. Speaking of Morocco, the Moroccan police will be patrolling the streets of Paris because the Parisian police just isn't good enough anymore. In other news, if you object to the high number of Moroccans in Italy and tell them they should at least consider maybe going back home, that makes you legally Hitler in Italy. And in England, we might see an abolition of the disdainful legal lunacy called misogyny hate crime. But don't hold your breath on that. Oh, and in France, the franchise will be extended to those who quite literally don't know they are in France because equality or something. These are our stories on Periodic Insanity. Hello everyone and welcome to the 22nd episode of Periodic Insanity. So, in the last episode we left it off at mass immigration in Spain and the economics of Spain. So the first two pieces of news are exactly about that. The first, coming from El Mundo: immigrants will have the right to healthcare under the same conditions as Spaniards without having to register. Progress, comrades! Progress! Immigrants in an irregular situation will have the right to receive healthcare under the same conditions as Spaniards without having to justify their residence in Spain if the social services confirm that their country cannot pay for this coverage. This is established in the draft royal decree that establishes health coverage for all people, both those who are in an irregular situation, who are the majority, and those from countries that cannot afford this assistance or do not have a private health insurance policy. Thus, for irregular immigrants, the rule excludes the obligation to accredit the minimum registration period of 90 days required by the immigration law to obtain temporary residence. This will be on social services of the communities who have the power to accredit and grant the right to healthcare to foreigners who have not passed the period of temporary stay referred to in the immigration law, that is 90 days. For immigrants who reside in Spain on a regular basis, and the autonomous communities will be responsible for setting the requirements and the documentation they must provide to obtain health coverage. In addition, the decree modifies the sanitary reform in such a way that foreigners not registered or authorized as residents in Spain will pay only 40% of the price of prescribed medicine. So, basically, legal immigrants who've gone through the process of obtaining legal form in Spain and are now taxpayers in the Spanish society will have to continue to go through a heavily bureaucratic process in order to access the healthcare they have already paid for at gunpoint thanks to the heavily socialist taxation policy of the Spanish kingdom. Meanwhile, illegal immigrants, irregular immigrants, we'll just get stuff for free courtesy of the Spanish taxpayer and the legal immigrant taxpayer. I'm sorry, but in what universe does this make any sense? I mean, it basically says that it's much more profitable to get into Spain illegally than to be law-abiding. And who's going to pay for this free medical tourism? Because again, Spain has a debt to GDP ratio of 98%, and the newly installed government just announced it will slow down the reforms to get the country back on track, and instead will spend more money that it already doesn't have. So who's going to pay for this? Well, likely the German taxpayer combined with every other solvent business on the continent that deals in euros whose value will be slowly tinkered with by the Keynesians in Frankfurt. That's who's gonna pay for it. And because that's not bad enough, even if the current government somehow gets ousted, it is now a legal obligation to bring even more illegal immigrants in Spain. Spain must take in more refugees, Supreme Court orders, titles the local España. Spain's Supreme Court has ordered Madrid to take in more refugees after ruling it had not honored its EU commitment to accept at least 16,000 asylum seekers from Italy and Greece, it announced Wednesday. More than 6 months after the deadline expired, a report by Spain's Office for Asylum and Refugees recognizes that the current track record with respect to its final obligations is below 13%, the court said in a ruling dated July 9 but released on Wednesday. As a result, Spain must continue the procedure to take in refugees, the court added, but stopped short of fining the government. In September 2015, at the height of the migrant crisis in Europe, EU member states reached a deal to share out 160,000 asylum seekers who had arrived in Italy and Greece within 2 years to ease the pressure on both countries. Spain had pledged to take in at least 16,000 migrants. Like Spain, most countries have not met their commitment, and many migrants have left Italy and Greece of their own volition rather than wait to be transferred. Since then, more and more migrants crossing the Mediterranean have chosen to head to Spain rather than Italy or Greece. With 15,426 arrivals so far this year, according to the International Organization for Migration, Spain has already overtaken Greece and is set up to catch up with Italy. This, my fellow deplorables, is a recipe for disaster. You may think I'm exaggerating now, and that's fine, because I actually do hope I will be proven wrong on this one, but at this rate, another Spanish civil war is likelier than ever. Usually, when it comes to a civil war anywhere in the world, and any time in history really, it's not one or two decisions that trigger that said civil war. It's usually several years and sometimes several decades of utterly wrong decisions in a row that eventually piss off one or more segments of the society to such an extent that those segments decide war is less bad than the status quo. The build-up to a civil war takes a lot of time, so I'm not saying this particular decision can or will lead up to a civil war, but I am saying that when you put all the fundamentally wrong decisions, both economic and social, made in Spain in the last 8 or 9 years, when you put them all on the continuum or on an arc of history, as Obama would call it, the civil war hypothesis is no longer that far-fetched. Spain has the highest unemployment rate in Europe by a very far margin, and the youth unemployment sits at 35% as of April 2018. Who starts most wars? Young people start most wars, that's who. So, with more than a third of young people already doing nothing or being poor as fuck, all it takes is something or a multitude of somethings to piss them off, and the leader with a convincing rallying cry to emerge, and that's how you get a civil war. And just think about it. Let's say you are a Spanish young man. You've been unemployed for most, if not all, of your life, largely because there are no jobs, because nobody is foolish enough to create jobs under the notoriously restrictive Spanish labor law. And on top of that, you're being told by your government that you need to bring a notary into your bedroom if you want to have sex, otherwise you're a rapist. Then your university tells you that you are in fact privileged because you're white and male. Your father may have already killed himself or been ruined thanks to the women's courts, which for most of the previous decades, when you were a teenager, were busy destroying hundreds of thousands of Spanish families with government money. But you are privileged. Then one day you might remark that your town has been filled with Africans who aren't particularly keen with the peacefulness you grew up in, as they prefer a rather different type of civilization. You finally do get a job, but in Portugal. You tell yourself that the commute is worth it, but once you get your paycheck, the Spanish government taxes you once again. So you decide to speak up, but then you get hit with a huge fine for hate speech, and you're told once again to shut up, you privileged bigot. And then some charismatic dude shows up and says it doesn't have to be like that and invites you to a military training camp. They promise you food over there and companionship with like-minded people. Now, does this sound scary? These kinds of stories are already happening. They're nowhere near enough to be dangerous, but you keep on going at the current pace and that may change quite rapidly. Because remember, radical change doesn't come at the behest of a broad public consensus, but at the behest of a militant 10% minority, sometimes even less than that. And with a temperamental public like Spain's, and with huge tensions still going strong, not just in Catalonia, but also in the Basque, this is quite likely. Again, I sincerely do hope I'm wrong. The last thing Europe needs right now is a civil war anywhere on its soil. But these kinds of utterly irresponsible policies and decisions are making it more likely and not less likely. Anyway, staying in southern Europe, but moving to Italy, also from the local, telling migrants to go home is racism, rules Italy's top court. In the landmark decision, Italy's highest court has ruled that telling migrants to go away is racism. The Court of Cassation ruled Thursday that telling non-EU foreigners to leave the country legally counts as racial discrimination, even if racial slurs are not explicitly used. The case relates to a man in his early 40s who appealed for a reduction in his sentence for injuries against another person, which had been increased on grounds of racial discrimination. The man and his co-defendant had clashed with two non-Italians after they approached them in a club in the town of Gallarate in Lombardy and said, "Why are you here? You need to go home." The applicant argued that his comments were unrelated to race. The court, however, found that using generic expressions of contempt towards foreigners that are clearly based on their ethnic or religious backgrounds is equivalent to racism. The ruling clarifies that Italy legally considers discrimination to occur in verbal attacks where racial superiority is implicit and not only where racial slurs are being used. Italy's interior minister and far-right League party leader Matteo Salvini, known for making provocative statements regarding minorities and immigrants, responding to the ruling by writing "Go home, go home, go home" on his Facebook page above a picture of a group of black African men. Last month, he sparked ire among human rights groups by referring to a migrant rescue ship's cargo as human meat. Italy has experienced several racially motivated attacks in recent months, the most high-profile of which involved the shooting of 6 African migrants by a far-right sympathizer in the town of Macerata in February. Well, as I was saying, that's how you get shit like this. I mean, seriously, random people don't become violent out of the blue. They're either innately violent, which is the case for a tiny minority of the population, we tend to call those criminals, or they are being pushed into it. And when speaking freely about the problems facing your community is not allowed, or worse, you're being forced to pretend nothing is wrong, even while your eyes can see clearly that something is indeed very wrong, violent outbursts are not very far away. This is true anywhere on Earth. It's not something specific to Italy or to Europe or to China or whatever. When every safety valve to at least air the societal frustrations, but also at least attempt to solve some of them, when all of that is taken away, militant and, dare I say, mindless nationalism and violence becomes the only way. Italy dodged a serious bullet with Salvini because just a year ago it seemed that Italy is utterly condemned to be ruled in perpetuity by Brussels puppets who do nothing to address the immigration problem or indeed any other problem that is actually of interest for the voting public rather than the European Central Bank or the disconnected fools in the European Parliament. So in this regard, Italy is in a better position than Spain is, but how long will that last? Because for now, Salvini is not exactly delivering. In fact, he seems quite naive about how these things work. Recently, for instance, he got into a spat with the Czech Republic when the latter told him to fuck off as he was proposing to the Czechs to take some of the refugees. he doesn't seem to understand that the whole European agreement was a lie, and that nobody, except Angela Merkel personally, but not her party anymore, and a few idiots in the Swedish government, but except these few minuscule individuals, nobody seriously believes in the whole refugee resettlement scheme. As for the countries of the intermarium, mate, we already made it pretty fucking clear when it was voted on. So Salvini is quite naive to continue to push for the so-called European solution to ease the burden on Italy, because nobody will take that seriously. And once the voters will figure that one out, let's just say that things will get pretty interesting. Anyway, maybe I'll make a separate video on the situation in Italy, or perhaps I can convince one of my Italian collaborators to come on the channel. I don't know. For now, let's move on to France. Coming from BFM TV, Paris, Moroccan policemen reinforce the good door. The 4 officers will have the mission to reduce the delinquency and proceed to possible expulsions. This is an unprecedented agreement that was signed last June between the French and Moroccan Ministries of Interior. According to information from LOBS, 4 Moroccan police officers will soon be sent to Paris for a special mission. Their role will be to take care of teenagers from this country of the Maghreb, isolated and wandering in the district of Goutte d'Or since their arrival on the French territory. As Lobs always points out, the situation is explosive in this district of the 18th arrondissement. Now, for those who may not know, Lobs is the former Le Nouvel Observateur, which is a left-wing newspaper. Okay, so back to the article. These young men, whose origin are in the 2 Spanish enclaves of Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla, are in transit and would like to join the countries of Northern Europe. But since 2017, crimes have been multiplying, and acts of aggression, drug addiction and prostitution are frequent. In the past year alone, 813 police arrests have been recorded concerning these crimes, before we even mention the exasperation of the residents. Thus, the role of the Moroccan police will be twofold. Accompanied by French agents, their mission will be to reduce crime and irregular immigration in the form of organized crime. Here's that term again, irregular immigration. A document consulted by the newspaper specifies the field of action of the agents: to audition the Moroccan unaccompanied minors and to collect the information allowing to launch the investigations with a view to their identification and their subsequent return to Morocco, close quote. Now, isn't it nice? The situation has gotten so bad that now France has to literally import policemen to deal with the crime. Now, I tried to look up a precedent like this in history, and I couldn't find it. I'm almost sure there is one such precedent somewhere in the world, but I couldn't find it. I say I'm almost sure because this kinda does sound as something quite unprecedented. I mean, there have been crime waves and spikes in almost any country in the world at some point in time in every century, but it is quite hard to find a period in which things have gotten so bad that the state had to import policemen from the country of origin of the criminals in order to effectively deal with it, or at least hope to effectively deal with it, because we don't know the results yet. But anyway, unprecedented or not, this is in and of itself extraordinary at the very least, even by French standards, a country already quite accustomed with cultural enrichment, diversity and progress. We should note this new propaganda term, irregular migrants, which marks the abandonment by the left of the term refugee, because it clearly did not catch on with the public. But then again, we've been playing this game for many years now. They come up with a new term, we mock it, turn it into a joke, they move on. Same thing happened with diversity, cultural enrichment, all doctors and lawyers, refugees, progress, and so on and so forth. So the issue is that the problem will not go away anytime soon, and in the case of France, and indeed Belgium, the problem may never go away, or at least not during our lifetimes, as more and more followers of the religion of special needs have acquired citizenships or have a ton of anchor babies, and now the good old European taxpayer is liable for them too, and the invaders have rights as well. And to make things worse, the courts increasingly side with the invaders rather than the natives and the Judeo-Christian civilization. And to exemplify this better, coming from La Dernière Heure in Belgium, pools do not have the right to ban the burkini. In two of its judgments, the Genk court overturned the burkini ban that two swimming pools in the north of the country had decreed, writes the newspaper Media UI. Prohibiting this bathing garb for reasons of hygiene or safety is not justified, as the government itself has provided scientific evidence that there are no problems with these. The Tervallen communal complexes in Merelbeke and the Van Eyck communal pool in Ghent can no longer prohibit women from bathing in burkini. Institutions will have to adapt their rules even if calls are introduced in the coming days. These cases were brought before the court by Muslim women who are now also entitled to compensation for moral damages, close quote. And this, my fellow deplorables, is exactly what happens when you allow the state to create such disdainful fiction as private space for public use. Remember when I kept on telling you it is absolutely retarded and indeed uncivilized for the state to have the authority to dictate what can or cannot be consumed or worn in a private business, even if the place is open to the public? Because I do remember. Also remember when I kept on telling you that the freedom of association must prevail, or otherwise the slippery slope will slip into a terrible place? Well, here are the results. Basically. First, it started with things that many dickheads thought were sensible, even though they absolutely weren't, like smoking in bars or limiting working hours in the case of Belgium. But then, based on that, it kept on growing, and the courts have created more and more case law in which the state basically gets to decide what is a compelling interest instead of the business owner. So now the state decides that the interest of an alien prevails over the hard work and risk taken by the business owner or the community to open up and maintain a pool. Just like the state decided that non-smokers have an unalienable right to be in the smokers' bars, and thus all bars have to be anti-smoker, now the state decides that Muslims have an unalienable right to be in civilized pools, and thus all pools have to be uncivilized. Now you enjoy it, lefties, and also naive fools on the right, who got suckered into surrendering such power to the state. This is what I always tell to people. You may like how the state is using a certain power right now, but sooner or later the state will use that same power in ways that not only you will not like, but will absolutely harm you. And then there will be few things to do about it, because when you surrender a freedom to the state, there aren't many peaceful ways to get it back. Alright, now let's go to a story. And this is basically a follow-up to a story we covered 2 years ago. If you remember, the Nottinghamshire police was due to treat misogyny as a hate crime, and at the time I said it's a complete and utter waste of police resources that will at best achieve no results, or at worst increase the level of institutionalized misandry. Well, it turns out that something rather close to the best case scenario happened. Treating misogyny as a hate crime is a waste of time, officers say, as police record one conviction over 2 years, titles The Telegraph. Treating misogyny as a hate crime is a waste of time. As police said, a report reveals that there has been just one conviction during a 2-year scheme. A paper by the University of Nottingham said that officers at Nottinghamshire Police thought the policy was a ticky box exercise which used up their time and resources. Under plans being considered nationally, crimes such as harassment could attract enhanced sentences if motivated by sexism and are recorded as misogyny hate crimes. Nottinghamshire Police has been recording offences as misogynistic where sexism is involved in an effort to encourage more women to come forward. While the public supported the change, and women who had reported incidents were broadly positive about it, police were dismissive and not in favour of the introduction of the policy. Research by Professor Louise Mullaney of the University of Nottingham and Dr. Loretta Trickett of Nottingham Trent University's Law School found. Officers said it incorporated some behaviors that were fairly trivial, that did not warrant a police response, and that it involved a waste of resources without being backed by a mandate from the public. One officer said that it felt like a vanity project. I just think if someone wolf whistles you when you walk past a building site, so what? Really? If someone came up to me in the gym and said, "You look good in your lycra," I'd take it. Thanks. I can see where they are going with it, but I feel sorry for blokes because they must be confused by what they can and can't say, and it's alright for women, isn't it, to go, "Oh, you look like this or like that," because there's nothing the other way around, and women do it just as much men do it. It's acceptable too, so I just struggle with the whole thing. A spokeswoman for Nottinghamshire police said the aim of the policy had been to encourage the public to report the behavior as opposed to pushing for lots of convictions. In most areas, crimes where a victim has been targeted on the grounds of characteristics, including race, sexuality or disability, can be made aggravated offences and the perpetrators given longer sentences, but gender is not one of those categories. The issue is due to be debated at a meeting of the National Police Chiefs Council on Wednesday, and campaigners have urged senior officers to extend it across the country. In January, Assistant Chief Constable Mark Hamilton, who leads on hate crime for the National Police Chiefs Council, told the Women and Equalities Committee that he believed the police would take the policy forward. Criticism from police contrasted with the views of the general public, which were broadly positive, with almost 90% of those surveyed saying it was a positive change and 67% saying it should continue unamended. 174 incidents were reported over 2 years, with 73 categorized as crimes and 101 categorized as incidents. A spokeswoman for the NPCC said, quote, "Police forces in England, Wales and Northern Ireland annually monitor 5 strands of hate crime. Police chiefs will be presented with a paper that asks them to consider the case for monitoring gender-based hate crime in the same way," close quote. Now, if you don't mind, I will have to question the 90% figure because it is either utterly false or obtained via deceitful questions. However, the 67% figure of allegedly members of the public wishing it to continue unamended suggests the respondents were presented with at least some of the details and the respondents agreed with them. If that is the case, then I hope it does get implemented, because it means the public is already stupid beyond redemption, so what's the point in trying to oppose it? This is something that many of the British followers of this channel will probably disagree with me, but the British public is incredibly tolerant with abuses of power that would never be tolerated in most of Europe. It's almost as if all of the families and individuals who loved freedom left for good in the United States, and only the stupid stayed behind. Because there is no other way to explain it, how the people that created the Magna Carta and had the first major breakthrough in the evolution of thought and policy around individual liberty are the exact same people who are now supporting such disdainful bullshit like hate crime, or the notoriously wasteful and malfunctioning NHS, and indeed the criminal NHS, and all with essentially no fuss. I mean, I was thinking about this a few weeks ago. If a case like Alfie Evans, for instance, had taken place in Romania, there would have been someone sacked, and likely someone would have gone to jail over it too. But in Britain, almost no fuss, no protests, no letter-writing campaign, no nothing. Same here with this whole hate crime business. We film the police all the time here, and most people here assume outright that the police is out there to commit abuses and needs as many checks and balances as possible, and that assumption in practice has slowly made the police better. In the UK, on the other hand, the assumption is that the police is never wrong, never corrupt, even though it kind of is, never out to commit abuses, and in the rare occasions when the police is questioned, it's questioned exactly on an issue where it isn't wrong. Such as this one, where the officers are absolutely right to call this a waste of time and a double standard. I don't know. Maybe you can explain it to me, because I honestly don't understand how can so much insanity exist on the same island. And And speaking of insanity on the island, two pieces of news I won't read but just briefly mention. The leading British conversation radio leading Britain's conversation radio, has a longish story about how London has 3 acid attacks every week. Now this is quite extraordinary and again makes me wonder, why do people tolerate that shit? But the story is relevant because it appears in a very mainstream source, so you could use it in various debates, as nobody can call it far-right propaganda or whatever slur is fashionable today to dismiss valid evidence. Then there is the story in the Daily Mail: cafe removes offensive street art of mankini-clad Sadiq Khan and Theresa May in provocative outfit after council brands it contentious day after mayor allowed blimp of Trump in a nappy. This basically puts another nail in the ridiculous claim by Sadiq Khan that there is such thing as Britain's commitment to free speech. No, there isn't. The United Kingdom today has a level of free speech highly comparable with communist Romania, and oftentimes less so. I mean, we could at least make jokes about Muslims back in the 1980s, but we couldn't make street art about the mayor or the prime minister. Just like in the United Kingdom. I'm wondering whether we could reach a deal with Theresa May to send you all of the former commie apparatchiks over here. They are a bit old, but they could be valuable in helping the British government implement the communist utopia that they obviously want. I mean, I'm just saying. And seriously, hurry up, Mrs. May, they're getting really old, so you might miss out on their tremendous experience and expertise with communist utopias. Anyway, in the meantime, Richard Dawkins, himself a leftist, is again in trouble with the left once again because he said he prefers the sound of the lovely bells of Winchester, which in his opinion are much nicer than the, quote, aggressive sounding Allahu Akbar, close quote. He also called the Winchester Cathedral, quote, one of our great medieval cathedrals, unquote, which, according to the left, is either racist if he meant our as in our civilization, or xenophobic if he meant our as in our British cathedrals. Apparently, preferring the soothing sound of church bells over the Islamic call to prayer is racist, because God knows how many years will have to pass until leftists finally figure it out that Islam really isn't a race. Islam is many things, but out of the many ills, sins and defects that Islam has, racism isn't really one of them. And while we're at British-related insanity, throw in yet another case of criminal man who says he's a woman, the British prison system believes him, and then he goes on to assault some more women while in prison, because why the fuck not? I guess I can't accuse the Home Office of being too ill-intended in the case of Tommy Robinson, who was also moved for a short while in a prison full of Islamists who literally wanted him dead. It seems that it is a recurring practice in the United Kingdom prison system to put potential offenders right next to their victims. It's almost as if incompetence and stupidity, aided by blind allegiance to far-left ideologies, reign supreme. Jesus Christ, the whole place is a meme at this point. I mean, whenever I think something is really bad here in Romania, all I need to do is to just look up British news on the same topic. About 9 out of 10 times I get a huge morale boost. I mean, hey, things may be bad sometimes here, but it's not Britain bad. Jesus Christ. Anyway, since we are on the periodic insanity episode, let's go back to France and talk about quite literal insanity. Coming from La Chaîne Info, Macron announces the right to vote for all persons with intellectual disabilities under guardianship. Emmanuel Macron announced this Monday during his speech at the Congress of Versailles the forthcoming opening of the right to vote for all mentally disabled persons placed under guardianship. In France, more than 385,000 individuals who have reached the age of majority are under guardianship would be affected by this provision. A Secretary of State in charge of disabled people, Sophie Cluzel, had already taken a stand on the issue. The President of the Republic announced Monday the upcoming opening of the right to vote for all such persons. It is also a policy of return to full citizenship, we will assume, and those also for these people, including those under guardianship, a return to the right to vote, said Emmanuel Macron in front of all deputies and senators gathered in the Congress at Versailles. This is excellent news, said the Secretary of State's entourage. We are putting people with disabilities back in their full rights as citizens. This is a strong measure of the position of these people in France. Since 2009, the amendment of Article 5 of the Electoral Code, persons under guardianship, the vast majority of whom are mentally ill or psychologically disabled, can go to the polls unless a judge decides otherwise. Previously, the situation was the opposite. Persons under guardianship did not have the right to vote unless an exception was decided by the judge. A considerable advance, but far from sufficient in the eyes of the NGOs who defend their rights. Today, more than 385,000 French people would be affected by this provision, of which between a quarter and a third are deprived of their right to vote. That said, should we then repeal or amend Article 5 from the Electoral Code? These legal questions remain to be solved, Sophie Cluzel told LCI last February. I do not have the answer yet on the means, but I have a very clear vision of the objective. Clearly grant the right to vote for all persons with disabilities unconditionally. In the columns of La Croix, the National Association of Judges and Courts estimated in January 2017 that an individual with a severe mental disability may see his suffrage aired. Fears swept by the Secretary of State. Let us keep in mind that it is in this respect that women have been, it is with this argument that women have been deprived of their right to vote for so long. The inclusive society is the one that recognizes the other, whatever be the differences, like a human being to the same universal rights. Oh, yeah, that's right, pull the women card, because they're totally fucking comparable. So there you go. Let's have the literal retards voting, because that's progress, n'est-ce pas, Comrade Macron? Let's be clear about this. The reason such restrictions exist essentially everywhere in the civilized world are twofold. One is because such individuals oftentimes don't know how to pee properly. Not that they can't, they literally don't know, and indeed have no concept of where they are. But the second reason, and perhaps the most important one, is to prevent multiple voting or voter corruption. Now, this may not seem like a big issue in a big country, but in smaller communities during local elections, this can make a difference. And since such people are legally under guardianship, that essentially means that they are to be considered children in almost all respects, including voting. Which means they'd have to vote while assisted by their guardian. So whether you like it or not, their vote will be akin to a vegan cat. We all know who will be making the decisions, and it won't be the cat or the mentally handicapped individual. That is why such legislation was enacted in the first place and continues to exist, and indeed should continue to exist. Now, you can argue details. For instance, should maniac depressives be allowed to vote? Maybe they should. Or should those with the physical age of 20 but the mental capacity of a 7-year-old be allowed to vote? Maybe they shouldn't. But this is not what Macron is discussing. He is discussing the abolition of any restriction except the requirement to be a citizen and be physically above the age of 18. Such approach already exists in Austria, Finland, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden. But then again, Austria also allows 16-year-olds to vote, a practice with dubious results. Finland and Sweden are small countries population-wise, and in Spain, well, we covered Spain already extensively during the last 2 episodes. I would argue that they need to put quite a lot of voting restrictions back up rather than go further down the pit. As for the Netherlands, let's be realistic here. It's a country the size of the metropolitan area of Houston, Texas. Now, of course, with all of that said, one can always argue that it's no big deal. So what if a few local elections may be decided by basically the person who happens to be the legal guardian of 2 or 3 mentally handicapped individuals? That's not a big deal, right? But it's not just about the impact. It's also about the principle. Voting what's supposed to be for and by those who understand what they're doing and have some sort of I guess incentives, or maybe skin in the game, as Taleb would put it. But over the last 50 years, it has gotten less about skin in the game and now also less about even understanding what the hell you're doing by lowering the voting age to 16 in some places or extending the franchise to people who really should have no business in voting, such as criminals and the mentally handicapped. You wonder why the quality of political classes continues to diminish in Europe? Well, that's because increasingly, quite literally, any idiot can vote. And when that's the case, the politician who wants to win has to pander to the lowest common denominator in order to have a decent shot at winning. At least in the US, one has to go and register to vote. In Europe, not even that is the case. Nothing will change as long as voting means increasingly less. Not via democratic means anyway. And when politicians will figure out a way to extend the voting to so-called irregular immigrants, then it will be game over to this experiment with democracy. That will be it. Koniec filma, as they would put it. And then, what happens then? Well, then there'll be dragons. Anyway, enough for this episode. Jeez, there are still a lot of news in the queue. I guess you're getting 3 episodes in a row then. I'll go grab some more coffee and we'll tape another one because I really want to go through the whole queue, even if I have to go faster to include more news per episode. Anyway, until then, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider throwing a few dollars my way if you derive any value from the work being done here. Please do subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.